Welcome to the Ubuntu Institute of Ideas, a vibrant platform at the forefront of Africa's politics, economy, finance, and geopolitics, and a vital connection to its dynamic global diaspora. Anchored in the profound philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because we are, this is where Africa's story is reimagined and its voice amplified. Through compelling conversations, incisive analysis, and transformative stories, the Ubuntu Institute challenges the status quo, ignites collaboration, and charts a bold path toward a future where Africa thrives as a cornerstone of a truly interconnected world. Join us as we elevate ideas, empower voices, and inspire progress that transcends borders and generations. In today's episode, Cameroon at a Crossroads, a nation in transition, we explore a nation navigating the fault lines of history and the challenges of tomorrow. For over 40 years, President Paul Biya has defined Cameroon's political and economic landscape, a tenure marked by hope, complexity, and controversy. From early promises of prosperity to the stark realities of stagnation and decline, we unravel the enduring shadow of colonialism, examine Cameroon's delicate ties with France, and amplify the voices demanding a future rooted in sovereignty and self-determination. This is more than a conversation, it's a call to action for a nation on the brink of reinvention.
Okay, so we've got some really fascinating material here about Cameroon. And it looks like the country is really at a crossroads.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study, I think, As we head towards these 2025 elections, we're seeing a country that's dealing with so many of the challenges that face post-colonial African nations. You've got these internal power struggles, and then the legacy of colonialism and the influence of former colonial powers. It's all happening against this backdrop of economic uncertainty.
Yeah, and it seems like President Biya is at the center of all of this. I mean, he's been in power since 1982. It's hard to believe that's longer than many of our listeners have even been alive.
It's true. For a whole generation of Cameroonians, he's the only leader they've ever known. And the sources we have paint a really stark picture of the country under his leadership, especially that video from Kilimanjaro News Network, Paradise Lost. They don't pull any punches.
No, they don't. They make this really stark comparison between the Cameroon of the past, this country that had so much potential, and the Cameroon today, which is really struggling with poverty and corruption, and these kind of simmering regional conflicts.
Yeah, one of the things that they highlight is the decline of these national companies. They talk about Cameroon Airlines, which, used to be a source of pride. And now they don't even have a single commercial aircraft. It really speaks to this broader sense of economic stagnation.
It's almost like a symbol of a nation that's lost its way. They also talk about the decaying infrastructure, crumbling roads, the lack of investment in education and healthcare. It's a picture that many Cameroonians know all too well.
And what's really interesting is how the sources connect this decline to Biya's grip on power. They argue that he's created this system that benefits a select few, those in his inner circle, and everyone else is left behind.
It's like this vicious cycle. The economic stagnation fuels this social unrest, which in turn strengthens Biya's grip on power. Because he can present himself as the only one who can, maintain stability.
Exactly. And that brings us to these 2025 elections. Biya's age and the fact that he might run again really throws a wrench into things.
I mean, the man would be 99 years old at the end of another term. What kind of message does that send about democracy in Cameroon?
It's a question a lot of people are asking, especially because it seems like the electoral system is rigged in his favor. So if he runs, it's pretty much a guaranteed victory.
But what about the people? Are they just going to accept another 7 years of this?
There's definitely a lot of discontent. The sources talk about this growing sense of frustration, especially among young people. They see the corruption, they see the lack of opportunity. It feels like their country is stuck.
And then you have the Anglophone crisis, which adds another layer of complexity.
Right, and the sources really emphasize how Biya's response to this movement has been a major source of instability. His refusal to engage in any meaningful dialogue or address their concerns has just fueled the conflict.
But the sources also point out that this frustration and desire for change isn't just directed at Biya. There's also a growing awareness of the role that France still plays in Cameroon.
Yes, and that's key. You see Cameroon's relationship with its former colonial power runs deep. It's not just about language and legal systems. It's about these economic ties, military cooperation, and a whole network of agreements that some argue actually benefit France more than Cameroon.
One thing that really stood out to me is the CFA franc. this currency that several African nations share that's basically controlled by France. Critics say it keeps these countries dependent on France and prevents them from, achieving true economic independence.
And a lot of young Africans see this as a symbol of neo-colonialism. They're calling for a more self-determined path. And some are even advocating for a complete break from these agreements.
It's a bold idea for sure. But it speaks to the level of frustration that's out there. And it makes you wonder about France's motivations. Why would they continue to support a leader like Biya, even when it's clear that his rule is not really benefiting most Cameroonians?
Well, it's about maintaining influence. France has this long history of propping up leaders in its former colonies, leaders who are friendly to their interests, even if those leaders are, corrupt or authoritarian. It's a way for them to keep access to resources and markets.
So it's a trade-off. France gets to maintain its influence, and in return, Biya gets the support he needs to stay in power, even if it means overlooking human rights abuses and the needs of his people.
That's one way to look at it. It raises some tough questions about international relations and the responsibility of former colonial powers in the 21st century.
So we have Biya potentially clinging to power for another 7 years, a population that's increasingly frustrated. And this complex relationship with France propping up the whole system. It's a lot to think about.
It really is, and it makes you wonder what's next. Will Cameroonians accept another 7 years of Biya? Or will we see some kind of pushback? Maybe even a challenge from within his own party?
Well, the sources actually hint at a pretty intense power struggle within the ruling CPDM party. Maybe we can dig into that next.
Yeah, you've got this aging president potentially trying to hold on to power into his 90s. And that's really created this power vacuum. The sources suggest there's a lot of infighting within the ruling CPDM party. Everyone's kind of jockeying for position, trying to figure out who might be the heir apparent.
That's like a real-life political thriller. All these different factions vying for control with their own agendas and alliances.
Right, and the big question is, will Biya actually step down? Or is this whole election just a way for him to consolidate his power even more? Maybe even position a successor who will be loyal to him.
So let's talk about the potential successors. The sources mentioned a few key players.
Right.
What about Frank Biya, the president's son?
Well, Frank Biya is an interesting figure. He's a businessman, but he has no real political experience. And there are a lot of doubts about whether he could actually lead a country as complex as Cameroon.
Yeah, running a business is one thing. But navigating the world of Cameroonian politics with all the internal divisions and external pressures, that's a whole other ballgame.
Exactly. And some analysts suggest that Biya might be pushing his son forward, not because he genuinely believes he's the best candidate, but as a way to, maintain his own influence even after he's officially out of office.
Trying to keep the power within the family.
Exactly. But there's another powerful figure in the mix, Ferdinand Ngo, the Secretary General of the presidency. Now he's a much more seasoned political operator.
Yeah, the sources describe him as someone who's been at Biya's side for years, really pulling the strings behind the scenes. He's got a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless.
He's definitely someone to watch. He controls access to the president, and he's built up this really strong network of allies within the party and the security forces.
But there are also those allegations of corruption and abuse of power swirling around him.
Right, you can't ignore those. But it doesn't mean he's not a contender. In fact, some analysts think he's the most likely successor, whether Biya orchestrates it or not. There are even whispers of a power struggle between Ngo and Frank Biya, each of them trying to position themselves as the rightful heir.
Which could add even more instability to an already volatile situation. The Anglophone crisis and the...
Absolutely. And then you have to factor in the old guard. Those longtime Biya loyalists who've been part of the regime for decades.
People like Laurent Esso and René Sadi, the ones who have really benefited from the current system and have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo.
Exactly. They're unlikely to embrace any real change, and they're probably already figuring out how to hold on to their positions, even if it means siding with one of the younger contenders.
So you've got these three main factions: the son, the shadow president, and the old guard, all circling each other, waiting to see who makes the first move.
It's a high-stakes game, for sure. But the sources also remind us that this isn't just about the elites. There are millions of ordinary Cameroonians who are yearning for something different.
Right, they're the ones feeling the brunt of the economic hardship, caught in the crossfire of the Anglophone conflict. And ultimately, they're the ones who have the power to change the course of their country.
And the sources highlight this growing sense of frustration, especially among young people. They're tired of the corruption, the lack of opportunity, the fact that their country seems to be stagnating.
It makes you wonder if this frustration will actually translate into action. Will we see protests or demands for more transparency? Or will Biya and his inner circle just manage to suppress dissent again?
That's the big question. But one thing is clear, the situation in Cameroon is incredibly fragile. All these internal tensions and external pressures, it feels like something has to give.
Like a pressure cooker about to explode. And the 2025 elections could be the catalyst. It could either be a moment of peaceful transition, or it could trigger a wave of instability that engulfs the entire region.
And we can't forget about the Anglophone problem. This conflict has been simmering for years. And Biya's attempts to suppress the separatist movement have only made things worse.
You know, it's interesting. The sources point out that the Anglophone crisis has actually highlighted the marginalization of other groups in Cameroon as well.
That's right. The Northerners, for example, they make up a significant portion of the population, but they've long felt excluded from power and economic opportunities. They see the Anglophone struggle as a reflection of their own grievances.
So it's not just an Anglophone problem. It's a symptom of a much deeper issue. The government's failure to address the needs and concerns of a large segment of the population.
Exactly, and that's something any future leader is going to have to deal with. They can't just focus on appeasing one group while ignoring the others. They need to find a way to create a more inclusive society where everyone feels like they have a stake in the country's future.
It's a tall order, especially given how much distrust and division there is.
It is, but it's necessary if Cameroon is going to move forward as a nation.
So these upcoming elections are incredibly important. They represent a chance for Cameroonians to choose a different path, to demand a leader who will finally address the root causes of their problems.
Right. But as we've seen, Biya is a master of political survival. He's managed to hold on to power for over 40 years, and he's shown he's willing to use any means necessary to crush his opponents.
So is there any hope for real change?
Well, there's always the possibility of a surprise. Maybe a new leader will emerge from within the CPDM, someone who can unite the different factions and offer a real alternative to Biya.
Or maybe the pressure from the people will just be too much to ignore. Maybe we'll see a grassroots movement that demands change, a movement that goes beyond ethnic and linguistic divisions and calls for a more just and equitable society.
It's hard to say what will happen, but one thing is for sure. The future of Cameroon is hanging in the balance, and the choices made in the coming months and years will have a huge impact on the lives of millions of people.
We also can't forget about France's role in all of this. As we talked about earlier, they have a long history of interfering in Cameroonian politics, and it's often been to the detriment of the Cameroonian people.
Exactly. And they have a vested interest in maintaining their influence in Cameroon, both for economic and strategic reasons.
So will they continue to support Biya, even if it means propping up this regime? Or will they finally step back and allow Cameroonians to determine their own future?
It's a question that only time will answer, but it's one that we should all be paying attention to. Because the stakes are incredibly high. The future of Cameroon and the entire region could depend on the answer.
So on that note, maybe we can shift gears a bit and talk about the potential scenarios that might play out as we get closer to these 2025 elections. So we've talked about the potential successors and these power struggles within the ruling party. But what about the bigger picture? Like, what are the possible scenarios for these 2025 elections?
Well, the first scenario, and maybe the most likely one based on what we're seeing, is that Biya just runs again and wins. I mean, he controls the whole electoral system, and the opposition is really weak and divided.
Yeah, it's kind of a depressing thought. But it's hard to argue with that. He's gotten away with manipulating elections before. There's no reason to think he wouldn't do it again.
Right, and if that happens, it's hard to see how things would actually change in Cameroon. You know, you probably just see more of the same. The corruption, the repression, and this failure to really address the Anglophone crisis.
Would just be a continuation of the status quo, which is a pretty bleak outlook for a lot of Cameroonians, especially the younger generation who want something different.
Yeah, but there's also the possibility that Biya decides not to run. Maybe his health gets worse, or maybe he just realizes it's time to step aside and allow for a more peaceful transition.
That would be a huge deal. But even if he doesn't run, would the elections actually be free and fair?
That's the question, isn't it? The whole system is set up to benefit the ruling party. And there's a real chance they would just install another Biya loyalist, someone who would just keep things as they are.
So even though the chances for real change seem pretty slim, but let's just say for a minute that there is a truly free and fair election. What happens then?
Well, then it's anyone's guess who would win. The opposition would finally have a chance to present a real alternative to the CPDM.
But could they even agree on a single candidate? I mean, they've been so divided for so long.
Yeah, that's the challenge. They'd have to overcome their own divisions and present a united front if they wanted to have a shot at winning.
And even if they did win, they'd inherit a country that's facing some huge problems. A struggling economy, this civil war in the Anglophone regions. It would be a massive undertaking.
Absolutely. But it would also be a chance to really address the root causes of Cameroon's problem.
It would be a chance to build a more democratic society, a future where all Cameroonians have the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly, but let's be realistic. The chances of that happening, at least right now, are pretty slim.
So it sounds like Cameroon is stuck between a rock and a hard place.
It does seem that way. You have a president who refuses to give up power, a ruling party that's more interested in protecting itself than serving the people, and an opposition that's just too weak and divided.
And then there's France in the background, protecting its own interests.
It's a difficult situation, but it's important to remember that even in the darkest times, there's always hope.
And I think that hope lies with the people of Cameroon. They're the ones who will ultimately decide their future.
You're right. They've shown they're resilient and resourceful. They're determined to create a better future for themselves and their children.
And we've seen that in the protests and the activism, in the voices that refuse to be silenced.
And even if these 2025 elections don't bring about the change that everyone's hoping for, it doesn't mean the struggle is over. The fight for a more just and equitable Cameroon will go on.
And that's what I want to leave our listeners with, a sense of cautious optimism. The situation in Cameroon is really complex, but it's not hopeless.
The people of Cameroon have the power to change things. It might not happen overnight and it won't be easy, but it is possible.
And that's what makes this whole story so compelling and so important.
It really is. Cameroon is at a crossroads, and the decisions that are made in the coming months and years are going to have a major impact, not just on the country, but on the entire region.
It reminds us that we can't be complacent. We need to pay attention to what's happening in places like Cameroon, because the struggles they're going through are all connected.
Yeah, in a world that's more and more interconnected, the fight for justice and freedom anywhere is a fight for justice and freedom everywhere.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So to our listeners out there, keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and don't give up hope.
Hope is what keeps us going, even when things are tough.
Of reinvention. A huge thank you to our incredible panel for this eye-opening discussion. Your insights on colonial legacies, the CFA franc, and Biya's decades-long rule have brought clarity to Cameroon's challenges and its potential. As the nation stands at a pivotal crossroads, your expertise offers both direction and hope, illuminating the path toward independence, unity, and progress. To our listeners, here's some food for thought. Can Cameroon break free from neo-colonial structures like the CFA franc to achieve true economic independence? At 91, with a history of silencing dissent, can Biya's regime enable a peaceful and democratic transition? How can Cameroon heal deep-rooted Anglophone grievances and build an inclusive political and economic system? What steps can foster national unity while bridging ethnic and linguistic divides that fuel conflict? Can Cameroon craft an assertive foreign policy that loosens France's grip while preserving beneficial ties? Stay connected. Follow the Ubuntu Institute of Ideas for more transformative conversations. Like, share, and spread this episode to amplify Africa's voice and drive change across borders. The movement starts with you.